this town. Share our hearts for better. When the hero's down, we take it back together. We don't wanna fall.
Hej. Hej. Det är någon som säger hej tillbaka här. Det kommer Jag heter Katrin Marsall. Jag är till vardagsjournalist på DN och författare och har fått äran att leda detta pass om heliga och oheliga allianser mot kvinnors och flickors rättigheter i världen. And we will now switch over to English. And last year was a very interesting and special year for the global women's movement. It started in January with the Women's March, International Women's March against President Donald Trump, which turned into some kind of global movement many of us didn't think existed, and the kind of resistance against authoritarian populism gathered under a feminist flag or maybe a feminist pussy hat. What was all of that about? And the year then ended in the sign of Me Too, the international viral campaign against sexual harassment, assault and rape, which had big impact, not least here in Sweden. So yes, there's talk about a new feminist wave, a new global feminist wave. We will get into all of that in this session, but there's also all the threats against it. The fact is that the annual gathering of ministers for gender equality in New York, which takes place every March, it has for years been reaching more and more sort of toothless conclusions, and the situation has become so severe there's even hesitation around calling a 5th UN conference on women's rights, because many people and countries feel that this will just result in a watering down of the existing UN Convention on Women. So there's lots of things to be hopeful about and lots of things to be wary about. And we're going to talk about this in this session. And I'm going to welcome the panel. We have Megan Murphy, who's a journalist and the founder of The Feminist Current, a newspaper and podcast. Please come up on stage. Birgitta Olsson, yes, thank you. Birgitta Olsson, a member of the Swedish Parliament, prominent liberal politician and feminist. Mustafa Can, author and journalist. And Cristina Grenholm, theologian, author and feminist from the Church of Sweden. Megan, you have a podcast, which I recommend to everyone here. And you interview many feminists from many parts of the globe. What's your take on this last year? What's been going on?
I mean, it's amazing and surprising, to be honest. I mean, you sort of think often that, or I do as a cynical feminist, I think often that hashtag movements will be short-lived and that they're popular in the media, they're easy to cover. But this seems like it really has legs, and it's created real solidarity among women all over the world, and I think it's really amazing and inspiring.
So what are you trying to do with your podcast?
The podcast is about bringing light to the different kinds of work that women are doing all over the world, and in particular to the kind of work that women are doing at the grassroots level, and in terms of the independent women's movement. So the kind of stuff that isn't usually covered by the mainstream media, the kind of stuff that isn't simplistic, radical feminism, in other words, not just liberal feminism, not the kind of feminism that focuses on personal empowerment, on, pro-capitalist versions of feminism, things like that.
Trump feminism.
Yeah, and a real focus on male violence against women and prostitution and pornography and those kinds of issues that are often pushed to the wayside, especially in North America.
So what is radical feminism, if you can just give us a short summary?
I mean, I actually don't even call myself a radical feminist. I just call myself a feminist because I think that feminism is a real thing. And radical feminism just means, a lot of people think that the word radical means extreme or extremist. But really what it means is to get at the root. So it's just about looking at the root of male supremacy and patriarchy, and it's about focusing on the liberation of women as a whole, as a class, and about a collective women's liberation movement.
Birgitta Olsson, a liberal feminist.
Yeah.
What should we call this thing we've been living through or are living through? Is it a new wave of global feminism?
I have so many mixed emotions, actually, what we're looking up on today, because on one hand we see a very obvious backlash, and I think we should look on that in a wider context, because I think it's also a fight against democracy in Europe, in countries like Hungary and Poland. We have Donald Trump in the White House, and we see so many different, backlash on a variety of fields. But on the other hand, I'm also a strong feminist optimist. And I always think of my own personal family history, and I always go back that, reminding myself that my mother was the first one in our family that could study at university, and my grandmother, Betty, that was born 1912, she went to school less than 2 years, 2 semesters, and she started to work when she was like 10 years old at the farm. So I think we always need to acknowledge and to remind ourselves about the success stories that we have. And I totally agree with you when it comes to the Me Too movement. I thought also it was like a short hashtag story, but now we see it's growing into something more. So I think it's important to work on the positive waves that we have today. But we also need to realize that our enemies, they are getting smarter, and they are getting stronger, and they are getting more specialized in their attacks on girls' rights and women's rights. I was in New York in January this year, and it was very sad to see the different new alliances fighting women's rights, and they're smarter than ever, actually.
What did you say?
We have the normal, we have the usual suspects. We have the bad guys, we have the mullahs in Iran, we have the different Islamist movements in the Far East, we have many dictatorship countries, and we know our conservative guys in Europe too. But right now at the UN, they are building alliances with countries that are, we have authoritarian Russia and dictatorship China, but these countries, they are not that, conservative sometimes when it comes to women's rights, especially on abortion issues and others. But they ally with these others because they are very fond of the non-interference principles. They would like other countries to stay off their internal affairs. So they're kind of getting into this anti-feminist movement. And then we have what actually disappointed me most when I was in New York, was watching some countries from Africa and some countries from Latin America that do back home have more progressive views on sexual and reproductive health and rights and so on. But when they come to New York, it's much more important for them to stay with the African group or with their, so-called neighbors than to fight for the values that they actually have in their judicial system back home. So it's important we need to be smarter and we need to be more strategic also up on the European level.
So, Cristina Grenholm, Birgitta is talking about new alliances, a new backlash, which is happening at the same time as we have all of this new feminist wave. Is that your view as well? That is sort of this double paradox going on at the moment?
I do agree about the double paradox. And I want to say that is also part of religious life. So as we know, many of the conservative religious leaders, they take sides with those who are today challenging women's rights. But we also have strong movements within and between the religions affirming women's rights.
Okay. Mustafa Can, you're an author and a journalist, and you've recently been doing a very interesting project interviewing female soldiers. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's a play at Stockholm Stadsteater now, and it's based upon my travel to Syria, where I was smuggled over the border between Turkey and Syria, and I spent a lot of time with the Kurdish resistance movement, especially with young female soldiers, 18, 19, 20 years old, and some of them had never held a gun in their hand before ISIS attacked their villages. But this is not just a war against a barbaric movement, This is also, it's a two-front war. It's a war against the other enemies, but it's also a war against their own society or the old patriarchal structures in their old society. And they have gained a lot of respect in that society. Of course, I mean, you don't change 2,000 old structures in a couple of years. But at least, I mean, the female movement, the feministic, very radical feministic movement is not only by words or by school or education. Unfortunately, it is also by weapon. But they have achieved a lot in the region we call Rojava, the Syrian Kurdistan. Half of the minister posts are held by women. I mean, it's a huge revolution. I mean, we are talking about the Mideast, you know, Mideast, which when we think of Mideast, we think of nationalists, we think of dictatorship, we think of sexism, we think of sectarism, and of course, very old patriarchal structures. And it's quite amazing to be in an area and, you know, in the front line while ISIS is 800 meters away, and talk about feminism with the weapon Kalashnikovs in their hands. It's quite amazing.
And what did they say about feminism? What did they tell you about feminism?
Well, they say that, you know, it's quite basic. They say in our society, especially being Kurdish, you know, we talk about freedom, azadi, we scream for freedom and equality, but they say if we don't have freedom for all, we don't have freedom at all. And I asked them, okay, listen, there have been a lot of female guerrilla soldiers, I mean, in many places, in Algeria, in Nicaragua. Svetlinna wrote about them. So once the war is over, what will happen? I mean, do you really think you can change 2,000-year-old structures in a couple of years? They said, well, at least we have 30,000 female soldiers with guns in our hands. That's true. They are not going to give this up. You know, they know what they are fighting for. Imagine, they are younger than my nieces, 18, 19 years old, and they are so determined. They really, really know what they are doing. And at the same time, you know, they are not only fighting, they are talking about these issues all the time. Yeah.
That's right. So, Megan, So Birgitta was mentioning the enemies, the backlash. In Northern America, there's, you know, the obvious enemy to many feminists is the president and what he represents. What else is there?
I mean, what I think is really interesting and something that's talked about less is that a huge part of the backlash is actually coming from the left and from progressives and from liberals. So in Canada and the US, the progressives support prostitution and support the legalization of prostitution and have managed to paint feminists who oppose prostitution and who have fought for the Nordic model as conservatives. And so the entire labor movement in Canada is in favor of legalized sex work. And our leftist party in Canada is in favor of legalized sex work. And we have these, you know, progressive liberal organizations, Amnesty, UNAIDS, UN Women, the Democrats in the US that are all pushing for legalized prostitution, which is crazy. I mean, it's crazy. Like, it seems insane that...
And when did this change? Because have they always supported this, or what's happened?
It's really grown in the past decade, for sure. And you know, I'm not sure exactly why, but it's amazing to watch leftist people, anti-capitalists, support this billion-dollar industry, to support an industry like pornography, to support an industry like prostitution, which is entirely based on exploitation, and to position that as a progressive position and a feminist position, and to co-opt our movement, and to call us the conservatives and the people who want to control women's bodies.
Because there is some of that going on, isn't it? Sort of branding feminists as conservatives. You know, we have that in the backlash against the Me Too movement as well. That you're against sex, right? You're against this is a new Puritan movement. You've noticed that?
Yeah, and I mean, it's really hard on young women because young women are afraid, for good reason, of being called prudes, of being called prudish. So the only position that young women feel like they can take is one that is in favor of the sex trade, because otherwise they'll be called regressive, and they'll be called conservative, and they'll be called prudish, and they'll be called anti-sex.
But yet also a feminist backlash within the left in the liberal community. Do you agree?
Well, I think when we're discussing the issue on prostitution, I think this debate in Sweden has been very different from also many other European countries, because we've had a broad alliance when it comes to supporting our law charging the sex buyer. I mean, almost every single party in the Swedish parliament have a very strong support for that law, and it will definitely not change, I mean, in the right of future. But when I go out to other European countries, I think actually most of my liberal colleagues in many countries in Europe, they have another position on this issue, and also among the Greens and among the socialists. So it's I don't think that the debate is really as it is in the United States. It's perhaps a bit more diverse here, but the Swedish context is different from this one.
So Cristina Grenholm, you know, religious fundamentalism as a sort of a place for you know, a movement to reverse women's rights, that's talked about a lot. You were saying that, but actually, you know, the churches and religions are doing a lot of things to advance women's rights also on a global level. Would you give some examples, maybe, please?
Yes, I can give one example from a conference that was actually held in Sweden with the UNFPA. Is that the you know, it doesn't come out. The Population Fund. And the World Council of Churches representatives and people from Church of Sweden. And we had representatives from all religions, and they were both women and men, and affirming that we have to confront the view that the human dignity, religiously concerned, is something else, something set apart from human rights. But to emphasize that to speak up for autonomy, for your right to life, for your right to equal respect, is part of also the theological framework. And I think that is extremely important, and that we are also aware of the fact that the conservative voices, they are heard very well also among those in political power. But we need to emphasize that this is also part of religious life. And another, I think, inspiring thing is that last year was the 500 years anniversary of the Reformation. And the Lutheran World Federation, keeping a lot of Lutheran churches together around the world, they gathered, of course, for a general assembly. And what was put high up on the agenda was gender equality, gender justice, education for women, also in theology, because we know that the religious leaders, they have an enormous impact, not only on the people who come to their churches or to their holy sites, but also in a broader societal perspective.
Mustafa, how the women you've met, how do they talk about religious fundamentalism?
First of all, I have to say this quite amazing political project they are trying to achieve is based on secularism. And these women, you know, they're also challenging the dogmas of the religion, you know. I met a couple of imams, you know, and they said a couple of years ago, we would never have thought that it's so okay for I mean, total equality between the sexes. They use these words, you know, total equality between sexes. Maybe they said it 10 years, 15 years ago, but now they really mean it. So it's quite amazing that what this movement is doing in this region, in this quite conservative region, is that it challenges the traditional Islam. I mean, Islam has had no reformation like you have had. So that's a very positive thing, you know. And you were asking.
No,
because
that was a very good answer to my question. I was asking how they see religious fundamentalism and how they talk about it, and I think you answered that.
Yeah, I mean it's a bit. I came to Sweden when I was 6 years old. You know, my father is an illiterate. My mother is dead now. She was an illiterate. A lot of my relatives, they are quite conservative. They vote for Erdogan, who is an enemy of feminism, a complete enemy of feminism. And it's also quite amazing, you know, talking to my father. He's you know, he grew up without father and mother, and he's lived in Sweden, only working, living outside the society. It's also amazing to see how, I mean, his views when I talk about these women, and all of a sudden he admits that, well, imagine how wrong I have been for so many years. But what he also have forgotten is that exile, when we talk about feminism in a global perspective, exile is something quite amazing, because when people move to Sweden or to Norway or to Denmark, they get new values. Of course, there are clashes when tradition meets modernity, culture meets culture. But a lot of the young women and also a lot of young men, they transport their thinking, their way of seeing, I mean, their way of talking about feminism. They are challenging also their relatives in other countries who live in quite conservative areas.
So migration is somehow...
Migration is, you know, we talk about xenophobia in Europe and we say it's very dangerous, close the borders. Don't close these fucking borders. Excuse my expression, but...
People keep swearing from the stage. I don't know, it's the same in the previous panel.
I get so upset because in the end it results in something good. Civilization has always been built upon clashes, you know, new values coming. So that is also something that strikes me since I was born in a quite conservative environment, you know. Yeah.
So, Cristina Grenholm, what can the church do and what can religions do to help in this clash that Mustafa is talking about that's going on between cultures and generations? And
I do think it is very important that fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, is confronted both from a secular side but also from within. And I do agree that when we meet, we make connections and we can empower people, and not least women, because religion is something that is public. It's also something that is more private or more intimate. And actually, when you look at it, the suffragette movement and even the movement for the right for women to vote in Sweden was religiously argued for by those people like Fredrika Bremer, referring back to the fact that, well, they may tell us that women should be kept low, but I know I am created in the image of God as well. And that has joined people together in groups. It also empowers people when they feel lonely, when they are miserable. A lot of people pray who don't normally pray, and they get this sense, this cannot be right. Doing this to me, putting me on the side, suppressing my whole, what I belong to, the sex I belong to, the group I belong to, that cannot be right in the eyes of God. So that has been really a strong component in much of the women's movement, which has not been publicly addressed.
Okay. Megan Murphy, how united would you say the women's movement is? United enough to take on these enemies, or?
I mean, I think we need to start making connections and stop compartmentalizing. So I think that, again, you know, I'm most familiar with the North American context. Yes. And what's happening in the US and Canada is that we really like to compartmentalize, so we like to talk about we need to stop rape, and we need to stop rape culture, and we need to stop sexual harassment. You know, obviously this is this is the conversation that we're having because of Me Too, and yet there's a real refusal to connect sexual harassment and rape to objectification, the sexualization of women, pornography, prostitution, porn culture. You know, pornography is so mainstream these days. We see this imagery everywhere. Not only is pornography so easily accessible online, but we see that kind of imagery in advertising and in pop culture and everywhere. And, you know, I feel pretty strongly that we're not going to be able to truly combat sexual harassment and rape culture unless we take on all these other issues and if we connect them all. Because so long as men see women as sexual objects and things that exist for their pleasure, things that exist to be looked at, things that exist to fulfill their desires, sexual harassment and rape culture is going to continue to be the norm. So, you know, there is a women's movement that is confronting all these issues. There are feminists, obviously, who are confronting the issue of pornography and prostitution, but as far as the mainstream feminist movement goes, as far as liberal feminism goes, as far as third wave feminism goes, and especially in terms of how mainstream media is covering all these issues, there's a real lack of making these important connections, and a refusal to make these connections, I'd argue.
Birgitta Olsson, where would you like this, all the energy around the Me Too movement and this whole new debate, where would you like to direct that? Where would you like that to go?
Well, I think we need to realize that, I think actually we need to applaud almost all of the initiatives that we see right now, because it's very hard to join them into one huge movement. But what we've seen during the last year is still the most we've seen through a decade back. So I think we need to applaud that. But from a political strategy, I think we need to see more governmental responses too. And I was very happy when the Dutch government and the Swedish government and others initiated the response to the gag rule from Donald Trump, the campaign She Decides, on putting more money into the sexual and reproductive rights and health globally. I think that was a very, frank response, and we need to create more similar movements like that. But I think feminism, it will always be a very wild-grown bouquet of different flowers, and we need to accept that some are liberal, some are more radical, some are left. We have different angles, and we have different, perspectives, but all these can sometimes join. And I'm happy from a Swedish perspective that I think we've seen, actually, perhaps if we go like 5 years back, we've seen when it comes to issues like fighting sexual violence and so on, I think we've seen a broader movement, and the initiatives that we are here all today, and all the different manifestations, so on, and it's a start at least.
So Mustafa, when the women are taking up the Kalashnikovs and starting to talk about their rights and feminism, what happens to the men?
Oh. I recall a meeting with a man at the border between Turkey and Syria, 60 years old. And we talked about his daughters. 2 of them were in the army. And I said, listen, once the war is over, are they free to choose who they want to live with, education? He scratched his head and said, well, it's a bit difficult. I said, why is it a bit difficult? He said, it's not easy to overthrow a mentality you have had for 60 years. But I said, honestly, they are dying for your right to exist, for your right to live. And he said, yes, otherwise, if we don't give them, and then he said, our daughters and sisters, and not them, not the objects. If we don't give them the same freedom we have, then this has been for nothing. This has been for nothing. I have traveled in this region for years. You see a tremendous change of mentality. You really do. The fact that you don't only talk about the rights of women, but the fact that they have, they are in the public sphere, in the infrastructure, among principles in the economy, everywhere, it gives me a bit hope. But of course, I'm not so naive that I do think that it will change within a couple of years. But one thing all of them ask for is the support of feminists living outside Rojava and the Mistif. I mean, support from you. Because sometimes I get the question from all kinds of people, feminists or non-feminists, and they say, what is the difference between the Swedish feminism and the Kurdish feminism in Rojava? I think it's a stupid question, because if you ask them, what is it about? It's about equality.
Exactly.
That's it. Not more, no less. Yeah.
Birgitta Olsson, you have, a history of criticizing feminists of the left for not being, good enough and vocal enough about standing up against violence done to women in the name of honor. Do you think this has become better?
I think that, the whole Swedish debate actually, I think, started at least when we had, when Fadime Shahindal was killed, murdered by her father back in 2002. I think that was kind of the first thing that we had, and then we had several cases with both women and young men that were murdered. So I think it's better now than if we go 15 years back. But still, we see that, especially perhaps sometimes in the left party in the Swedish parliament, we see a lot of turmoil and a lot of fights. Still, that some people are not supporting enough the politicians that they have, like Amineh Kakabaveh and others that are really frontliners and pioneers. Talking about these girls and their different faith and background.
Mustafa, do you want to comment on that?
It's a big change when it comes to when we talk about honor violence, honor killings. 15, 20 years ago, a lot of people I know, they would say, what the hell is this? This is racism.
But to talk about it was racism.
Even my father talks about it. He's 84 years old, and he's not so conservative anymore. He's more liberal. I'm not. I'm maybe social liberal, but anyway, yes, you do talk about it in other ways. Especially among youngsters. It's nothing to debate whether it exists or not. 15, 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, you debated whether it exists or not. So the awareness, has improved a lot. But of course, it's still, we still have a long way to go, because this should not be an issue. This should not be
it's a fact.
Yeah, it's a fact, and it's quite infected, in many ways with when people accuse each other of racism or denial. But I see, the society I know among migrants, the awareness is huge.
Birgitta, brief?
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of hypocrisy during the years, and women could not expect the same level of freedom connecting to their background. But I think what we need to do now, that we need to align. We need to have the really strong focus upon the honor suppression and oppression and everything. But we also need to align the broad feminist movement, because education is so important for these girls, and we do not discuss that much in debate. Sometimes it's very connected to symbols, and I think we need to get economical independence and everything that need to be added more into the debate about how to support these young girls.
Megan Murphy, so in Europe, many of the authoritarian populist parties or far-right parties have sort of started to, not in every country in Europe, but in many countries in Europe, to sort of pose as we are the real champions of women because we stand up to a certain type of Muslim culture that is very degrading to women. So we stand up for gay rights, we stand up for for women, and this has all gone merged. The debate about sexual harassment has gone into these patterns, and it's all become quite difficult for feminists to be in that space and debate these issues. Has something similar happened in Northern America?
I mean, I think that men on the left and men on the right really like to try to define feminism for women. So men on the right will tell us that, you know, the real patriarchy is over there. You don't know what patriarchy is. What you're experiencing is not oppression. You're all liberated. Like, shut up. And the left is saying, we have the answer for you. We know how to liberate you. Here, here's sexual liberation. So we'll give you the pill. We'll give you reproductive rights. We'll give you access to abortion. And now you can empower yourself however you want through all your personal choices. And if that looks exactly like pornography, then perfect. Like,
And that's just a coincidence.
so, you know, I think that's why it's so important to have a unified feminist movement. I don't think that feminism is a bunch of different stuff. I don't think that it's just a label. I don't think it's a personal identity. I don't think that it's up for interpretation. I mean, the purpose of feminism is to liberate all women from the system of patriarchy. So when we're thinking about feminism, we need to think about not just ourselves, not just what feels good to us, but what will benefit all women the most. And therefore, if we do that, I don't think that we can defend, you know, industries like prostitution and defend pornography and things like that. But I think we really do need to push back against these men who are trying to co-opt our movement, to tell us what our movement should be, to tell us what our movement is. You know, women are half the population. We don't need them. It's not up to them.
Birgitta Olsson, because I know Birgitta has to leave soon. So these right-wing authoritarian populists trying to use feminist arguments while at the same time, in many cases, having an agenda which is all about sort of bringing women back into the home. What do we do about them?
I think it's important to look at their political program. And I had a debate with the Sweden Democrats actually this summer, and a lot of people in the audience, they were so surprised. Oh, are they anti-abortion, really? Are they promoting, I mean, housewife ideals when it comes to their, I mean, labor market policies and so on? And so I think very, very often a lot of people among the voters are not realizing the real politics behind these political parties. They try to work on issues like sexual violence if the perpetrator is someone from another country. Otherwise, they're not that interested. So I think it's important for us to reveal their agenda and the truth behind it, and to be stronger allies also in this area.
Cristina Grenholm, I know this is an important issue for
It
you as
is,
well.
and I do agree with you on broad alliances and brave alliances. And I think empowering people in their everyday life is very important. Empowering girls in school, in the homes, is of course very important. And to confront also all these mechanisms on a everyday life level. I'll just mention Ingrid Leroux, the Swedish physician who is working in South Africa. And she has worked out a system of mentor mothering, helping single mothers who were ostracized by everybody, put in the margins of the villages, no way really to survive. Now, how can you help them? Well, not by she going herself there, but by making other mothers who had experienced about the same thing, who belonged to the same group in some way, to go there and help, and to make sure that the truth that is spoken to you, but also acted upon you to make you feel small and to disempower you, they are wrong. So you can rise, and you have your right to your life, and you have a right to raise your kids. And I think we have many of those opportunities. I just mentioned school, medicine is another, church life and religious life is actually such a point also.
So, Megan Murphy, the rise of authoritarian populism in Northern America, that type of conservatism or whatever it is that the US president stands for, has that created, has more women sort of come to feminism because of that? Do you see that?
Definitely. I mean, the Women's March exists because of Trump.
Yes,
because he
but
was
has that
elected.
continued into a movement?
I mean, I think so. I think it really has brought a lot of women to the movement. It's made women really angry. It's made lots of people really angry, but we really need to harness that anger, and I think that we have in a lot of ways. And, you know, similarly with Me Too, and the Women's March again, which happened all over the world, and so many women came out to that event that, you know, had never been involved in feminism before. So, you know, like, obviously that kind of anger is powerful. Not that it's a good thing that Trump was elected, but I mean, we got to take that and run with it, right?
Mustafa, you're laughing?
Yeah. I mean, the nationalists, the populists, you know, even if you are the way they want you to be, or it doesn't matter, you're still an asshole, you know, something is wrong. I mean, I think of my sisters, for instance. My mother was a traditional woman, and she had a hijab. My sisters, they don't have a hijab. They live the same life I do, but still we are not good enough, you know. So I don't, when we are talking about...
Well, how do you mean they were not good enough?
No, I mean, from the Swedish Democrats often say, you don't give women their rights. I mean, you don't have equality. So if you are equal, you're not good. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have equality in families, you know, in a small society of people from Kurdistan or Lebanon or whatever. It doesn't matter. I mean, if you are what they accuse you of not being, you're still an enemy of the society.
They're still going to see you as that.
Yes. So it's. I mean, sometimes I wonder, even if all of the migrants, you know, become. I mean, if they would, I say we and them, I don't know. Sometimes I'm a Swede, sometimes I'm a Kurd, you know. so even if they become the way the nationalists, the populists want them to be, it's still not good enough, because I'm a foreigner, because I'm a Muslim. Now, I'm an atheist, but I'm of a Muslim origin, you know. So
it's just rhetoric.
Yes,
so
it
how
is.
do you then
the
challenge
rhetoric.
it?
I mean, and I've often thought, it doesn't matter whatever you do, you know, we are still the enemy. So you can give up or you can continue to show them. And that's what I'm trying at least to do. That's what my friends are trying to do. That's what my sisters and brothers are trying to do. Day after day and again, we have to show it that this can work, you know, people can change. I mean, cultures can change. I mean, what else can we do?
So, Birgitta Olsen, you were talking about the UN, and so what will, before you leave, what do you think will happen? Will there be a Fifth World Conference on women's rights, or these problems that we addressed earlier?
Now I feel a bit pessimistic, but here I think, actually right now I think far too many of us were too afraid to actually to lift these documents because we're afraid of a very possible backlash. So I think sometimes to be strategic and smart, you need to wait a bit, and you need to work more on your alliances. And what is though hopeful is that you also have some other countries that were not champions before but are now stepping up. So I think that the alliances perhaps are not the traditional Europe any longer when it comes to the more vulnerable human rights for women. But you can identify countries sometimes in Africa or in Latin America that you could. So I think we need to be more strategic. We need to be stronger. We need to be smarter, because our oppressors and our opponents, they are.
Megan Murphy, what would feminists in North America need from feminists here, for example, feminists in the rest of the world?
Well, I think feminism in Sweden is like heads and tails above and beyond what's going on in North America. I mean, I think that the left in North America has really become very cowardly, and I think
in what way?
that, I mean, the refusal to stand up against things like prostitution, the refusal to stand up against male violence against women, really. And you know, I'm totally amazed that the Nordic model, which is such a progressive model, which really is a socialist model, which is the only truly feminist legislation in terms of addressing prostitution, has been framed in North America as this regressive conservative legislation. And I think that North American feminists should really look to Swedish feminists to learn from them, and to see an example of real feminism that isn't, you know, that hasn't been co-opted by neoliberalism.
I think Birgitta also needs to go to Paris to continue the fight for women's rights, I assume. Thank you. Cristina Grenholm, do you think that churches and religious organizations should be more vocal on issues like pornography, for example, objectification of women?
Yes, I do, and I think in some ways we are, but we get into the problem that you were addressing before, that if you say this is a no-no and you're a church representative, you sound
so
very conservative.
Right, yes.
But I still think it is important not to give up, and I think it is important to join hands and to say this is not just the religious people who do this, but we do it together. It's not just the secular Muslims who have this experience of that we changed. We have it as Christians in this country also. We used to cover our heads 100 years ago. So it is, we need to tell each other stories, and I think the voices need to be joined into a big chorus.
We need to tell stories, Mustafa.
You know, I mean, there is a big problem also in Sweden and in many European countries. Some people are afraid to talk about it because they are afraid of being accused of being Islamophobias or xenophobes. But for instance, a lot of mosques in Sweden, they are financed by Saudi Arabia or Diyanet in Turkey. And what they teach out and what they practice in these mosques, I mean, it has nothing to do with feminism whatsoever. No, it's the quite opposite. So I think it's really important, I mean, among intellectuals, all of us and all of you sitting here, among politicians, to really have an honest and open and a serious debate of, I mean, should we maybe have departments at the universities educating imams, I mean, from Sweden, I mean, state-funded educations, instead of all the money coming from Qatar or Saudi Arabia because I have been to some mosques, not to pray, but when I've been working and what you hear, I mean, you really hear something about equality. When they talk about equality, they say that equality for us Muslims, but they don't never talk about equality between sexes. It's on the contrary, you know, some of the mosques are practicing and teaching out very, very deep patriarchal mentalities. That is quite dangerous, especially in this era when we live with xenophobia and populism rising, and the Swedish Democrats or nationalists in other countries, they can point out some mosques and say, listen, what they are doing, we were always right, and people who are not nationalists but a bit suspicious, because we also live in an era of suspicion. They said, yes, maybe they are right. That is very, very important. I mean, this is a big issue when we talk about religion. What are the mosques like here in Sweden? Who is providing them? Where do the money come from? What are the teachings? And so let's not be afraid of having an honest and open debate about that.
Because otherwise the
It is a
xenophobic
problem. It is
Yeah.
a problem, and it's even worse in countries like Holland and in Germany. You know, a lot of the ISIS members, maybe they have been rappers or drug addicts, and all of a sudden they go into a mosque, and all of a sudden they are. I mean,
Jihadi warriors.
Yes, absolutely. They have seen the truth. This is dangerous.
And it's follow the money with those mosques as well.
Absolutely. Follow the money. And don't be afraid of accusations about Islamophobia or racism. This is very important.
I'm going to see if there are any questions from the audience in English, eller om ni vill på svenska, if anyone's more comfortable with that. Yes, there's a lady here at the front. There's a microphone. Just briefly introduce yourself. And then please put your question to the panel. I think there's a microphone coming, yes. It's just...
Thank you. Human rights are women's rights, and we have been talking about values and standing up for values. And I'd like to introduce the concept of human rights, because that is something which most countries, everyone in the United Nations, has stood up for, the Universal Declarations. And most of the conventions have been adopted and by the UN family. So the introduction of the concept of human rights is important when we discuss gender equality and the value of every human being. I'd like to hear from you what you think about that and how that could be a concept to use in the discussion we have right now.
Okay. Any other question? We'll take two at a time. If someone else, there's somebody at the back there. Lady at the back. So this question, the concept of human rights, how can it be used to move women's rights forward, or maybe is it enough? That's the first question, and there's a question here.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for your guests. I would like, first of all, to comment on the wherever it is your background, religion background, cultural background, political background, women will ask about their equality in the society. If we go back to Herdman genus theory, when she talked about all the religions, headmaster, let's say, try to control the society and the hierarchy. They support the inequality in the society and change the norms. Maybe my question, it was to the guests who already left, but maybe your other guests could answer me. She mentioned that the immigrant women would like to preserve their cultural when they move to a new country. How can we help them to go over this and show them the opportunities when and where there is inequality in the society, especially here in Sweden, where there is the chance to do that.
I think
Thank you.
So integration of women from other countries. Maybe Mustafa could address that, but maybe we start with
I'm thinking more of the question about human rights.
Okay, we'll start with the human rights. Megan, do you want to say something about human rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is why I keep talking about the issue of objectification, because what objectification does is it dehumanizes people. So it's easier to perpetrate violence against somebody that you don't see as a full human being, that you see as an object, not a full person with feelings. You don't have to feel empathy towards somebody that you turn into an object. And so, of course, women are human. I mean, that's really the whole purpose of feminism, is to say we're real human beings. We don't exist to make babies for you. We don't exist to fulfill your desires. Again, we don't exist to be looked at.
So the human rights concept could be used in the discussion about pornography, for example.
Pornography and prostitution, yeah, of course. I mean, those are two industries that literally turn women into products to be bought and sold, into consumable objects, and it fits perfectly within a capitalist framework, of course. We can't say women deserve human rights and also say it's okay to sell women or to buy women.
And would you think it's more difficult, you were alluding a little bit to this earlier, to sort of challenge prostitution and pornography in Northern America because it's more of a capitalist society than, for example, the Scandinavian countries?
Yeah, I mean, capitalism is framed as liberatory in a lot of ways, and especially in America, the idea of making a choice, even if that's a consumer choice, is framed as empowering, and making money is framed as empowering. So in the US, liberals will say, you know, well, she's getting paid, she's making money, she's surviving, so it's empowerment. But no, of course, we want more than that. And in reality, if you think about who's profiting and who's benefiting from the sex industry, it's not women. You know, women aren't being liberated through this industry. This is an industry where women decrease in value as they get more experience. It's totally exploitative, it's totally abusive, it's totally destructive, obviously. But again, that's why there has to be that capitalist or anti-capitalist analysis when we're talking about all these things. You know, just making money doesn't justify anything.
So human rights can be used here. Mustafa, you wanted to come in on human rights?
Yeah, I mean, it's in the best of worlds, yes, it would be enough to use the expression human rights, you know. But I mean, in societies where I've been covering war and a lot of other societies with a lot of social and economic and gender inequalities. I mean, it is still, the reality is something else. It is still extremely important to still use the expression feminism. Because a lot of people in areas, you know, people who have been suppressed, I mean, ethnic groups who have been suppressed, they often shout human rights, human rights, human rights. But if you deconstruct their idea of human rights, it's right for the men, not for the women. That's why it is extremely important to use the expression feminism.
Feminism.
Yeah.
Okay. Cristina, the question from the back here, the challenge of integration, how, you know, women coming from other cultures, how do we make it possible for them to keep their culture, in many ways their religion as well, in some instances, and still sort of integrate in society in a, you know, way that works?
I think many of us have the experience of meeting points since the fall of 2015. We've had rich opportunities to meet with people who've just come to our country. And when you meet, as I said before, on an everyday life level, for having coffee, for going to these språkcafé, you get another view of life. And in our setting, because we have churches all over the place and we have people all over the place who come, and then you get to know women who do have another experience of freedom, because freedom can be scaring, but you can also be very attracted by, of course, by freedom. And I do think that there are also many initiatives where you bring women together, especially, for instance, in all the handiwork, you know, is that the crafts work?
Craft work, yeah.
That bring people together to tell their stories, to do things together, and to open up a wider view of the world, both for those who were born here, but also for those who come.
It's a two-way
It's
thing.
a two-way process, I believe. But I think it's very important to show what freedom makes possible for us.
Do you want to come in briefly on that?
Well, it sounds really nice, but you know, it's much more complicated than that. I mean, work and education. I mean, always work and education. I mean, to look at my family, for instance, 4 brothers and 4 sisters. Where would my sisters be today, you know, if they would only go to språkcafés? And I mean, I'm not saying that it's not important, okay? No, don't misunderstand.
And I agree with you on education, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where would they be today without work and education? I mean, they would be married with 6, 7, 8 kids, and you know, and the economic power would be in the hands of their husbands. Always work and education. And the question, of course, is, well, how do we get there? Well, that's another 2 days seminar.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you. So lastly, just very briefly, if you have some thoughts about how will we look back on these years, this feminist wave we're going through now, 10 years from now, how will we think about it?
I mean, I'm cynical, so I'm just warning
Please
you.
be. You're
that. I mean, in terms of, I have to be honest that I am disappointed in terms of what's been happening in feminism. I will say in a North American context, not everywhere. There have been successes in other places, like Sweden, for example. I think that what's happened to feminism in North America in the past couple of decades has been really harmful. I think that what we've seen is not a new wave. We talk about the third wave as another wave of feminism, but I don't think that it is another wave of feminism. I see it as a backlash. And I think
so the
it's
third
been really
wave is a
harmful.
backlash, and now are we in a fourth wave, or we're in nothing?
I actually don't like the wave analogy that much, because I see us as part of a cohesive movement. But the third wave really rejected second wave feminism, and they rejected radical feminism. And what we've seen now is this neoliberal, pro-capitalist, pro-objectification, pro-personal choice kind of movement. And, you know, young women are growing up in this culture where they're told that any personal feeling and any personal experience is valid, and so they've lost that ability to analyze women's oppression on a class basis, and they've lost the focus on this idea of a collective women's liberation movement, which we had in the second wave, and which we got from radical feminism, which came out of the second wave. So I do think that we'll look back and sort of be disappointed, but I'm hoping that
you're hoping that you're not
something else will come.
Okay, look back at this as it's disappointment. Okay, Cristina, what do you think?
I am-
Maybe something slightly more upbeat, please.
Yes, I am more optimistic. I think we're still moving forward, but it will not be done by itself. And I want to emphasize again, we need broad alliances. We cannot just have one way of coping with these issues, but many different ways. And we need to do it together in all levels in society, and also to look out into the world to the international community. So hard work, and we'll make it.
And we'll make this into the moment where we actually created a global feminist movement.
Why not?
Sounds nice.
Well, let's be honest. Well, when I look back, you know, I don't think that I will never forget my meetings with these young girls and women in Rojava, you know, fighting ISIS and their own patriarchal structures within their own society. But let's also be quite political in a sense. We talk about broad alliances. You all know what is happening in Afrin today. I mean, but the European Union, America, Russia, and especially the United Nations are once again betraying the Kurds. They ask for restraint while Turkey brutally violates international laws. And I think what is at stake in Afrin today is the future of an alternative, democratic and multicultural coexistence for a society and politics of the Middle East with a secular, gender egalitarian society. I mean, let's not disappoint them when we talk about broad alliances. Yes, we see Trump. Yes, we see a very misogynistic populism. I mean, shouting for conservative values. But I also see a huge and warm light from maybe the most conservative area, one of the most conservative areas in the world, the Middle East.
Sorry.
Yeah.
A moment of great possibility
yeah,
at
I
the
do.
moment.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
to the panel. Thank you to the audience. I know there were more questions. I do apologize. We ran out of time. It's been very, very interesting listening to you all. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Miriam.